In a past episode, I mentioned how stable our horn section has been over the years. For those who pay attention to such things, they'll know that has not been the case in every section, and notably our clarinet and double bass sections. In fact, we've had 18 different bassists on a full time contract since I began here in November 2008. Our principal, Jeff Kale, has the longest tenure of our current section, going on 15 years, and my guest in this episode is next, having been a member since September 2011. I've sat through a lot of Mozart 35 and Heldenleben at bass auditions, and though you won't see it as a solo instrument on many occasions, the musicians in our bass section might very well be second to none. This time on Meet a Musician, I talk with Richard Ryan.
Hi, I'm Richard. I'm a bass player, Kansas City Symphony, for 9 years, just starting my 10th year. And yeah, I was young when I joined. Maybe I'm still young. I don't always feel that way. But I am feeling like one of the old veterans these days, since, like Justin said, the bass section is almost completely turned over since I joined. But it's been a really great decade of my life so far in the KC Symphony.
Well, Richard, you mentioned that you were young when you started the job, but tell us about a really young Richard Ryan. What were you like? What was your early music education, and how did you turn into a professional bass player?
Well, according to my parents, I began asking for violin lessons at the age of 3, and they finally caved at 5 years old. So I began doing a Suzuki violin program when I was 5, and I was kind of a little big for my britches. So by the time I got to elementary school orchestra around fourth or fifth grade, my orchestra teacher was probably a little sick of me being a know-it-all on violin since I'd played since I was 5. And there was no bass player in the school orchestra, so she suggested that I take up bass as a second instrument. It'd give me a little bit more stimulation and maybe to put me a little bit more toward the back of the room so she didn't have to deal with me as much. So around the age of 11, after playing bass for a year or two, I started to find some success in terms of getting into better youth orchestras. So it just kind of slowly became my primary instrument over time. Age 11 and 12, I got into the Disney Young Musicians Symphony Orchestra, which is like a national summer youth orchestra festival where they showed the final performance on the Disney Channel, which was a big deal to me because my family didn't even have cable TV. So it felt like this, oh my gosh, amazing thing to be on cable TV. I got into the Sirius Youth Orchestra in Phoenix, Arizona, where I grew up when I was in 8th grade. And it just kind of took off from there. I just loved playing the bass, and I thought it was the best instrument, and I wanted everybody in the world to know that bass was the best instrument. And I was never seriously considering going into any career other than being a professional musician.
You mentioned that you had wanted to start the violin at 3. Did you come from a musical family at all?
No, neither of my parents are musicians or seriously studied any instrument. My mother did musical theater and things when she was growing up. My family became a musical family because of all of my musical activities. My sister studied instruments as well. And it just kind of became part of the culture of our family that we did music lessons and youth orchestra and things of that nature. I think for my parents, it was like the Wild West a little bit, trying to figure out all the difficulties of buying instruments, getting lessons, and figuring out all the things that you have to do in order to prepare for a path to, conservatory, to music school. And, they made a lot of sacrifices as a family so that I could have those opportunities. So I'm pretty lucky in that respect.
Well, you mentioned at the beginning that you were young when you started here. You're still young and still in the bass audition game. You've had nearly a 15-year career as a professional musician, I think, and 10 of it here. What are some of the biggest things you've had to learn on the job that you weren't prepared for as a student?
One of the things that's very different going from like a university atmosphere to a professional atmosphere is that uh, the expectations just instantly become much higher. My first professional full-time orchestra that I played in was the Louisville Orchestra, and I played there for 3.5 years, right out of school. Even though it's like in a smaller city, that orchestra was a big jump in level from university playing. The most difficult part was not necessarily the playing the music. It was the focusing and being responsible for yourself and being, you know, having a responsibility to the people around you, that you're on top of things, that you know what's going on, that what you're doing is not disturbing or distracting to anybody. I had to hold up my end of the bargain, and I think that that's an adjustment period for everybody going from school to professional orchestra.
I'm curious if you could just talk with us a little bit about what your approach is to preparing for and performing auditions.
When I began practicing after I had moved into my new apartment in Louisville, I was 20 years old. I turned 21 a week after I started my job. And I realized, like, I'm the professional now. I'm not supposed to need a teacher to tell me. And then I act like that. Removal of that safety net was an extra layer of, like, now it's on me to figure these things out. And so from then on, I treated basically almost every audition I've taken as an opportunity to, if not reinvent myself, like reconsider everything that I'm doing. So my approach to auditioning is basically every single audition I take, I try and push the boundary of how good things sound a little bit more. Because I think that as soon as you assume that you have everything figured out, that you're no longer going to get better at your instrument.
Yeah, well, speaking of teaching, you took part in our virtual bass masterclass that happened online recently. You were a teacher in that scenario. What did you learn from that experience?
When I first got out of college, I imagined that I could be a good teacher, but I felt a little lost when I was presented with the idea of teaching a beginner, because I felt like I knew what I could tell an advanced student. To teach a beginner, I had to really break down in a specific way what it is that I do and why I do all those things. And I also had to learn how to become a better communicator. And I had to learn how to empathize with the student. Just like in the audition circuit, where I'm constantly questioning my playing and my choices and forcing myself to reaffirm why I'm doing things and figuring out what I need to change. I think the same thing with teaching. Like, there's no such thing as a perfect teacher. And there's also no way that if you, as a teacher, just say the right thing, that a student's just going to magically get better. It's really about building a relationship with a student and kind of going on a journey with them. If music teaching were only like practice until you get better, then anybody could be a music teacher. And those video master classes that we did, there was these new students that I had never encountered before. And every time I meet a new student, I have new insights by watching them play about what I think they could do to be better, and also things that they do really well that are amazing to me. And I think about both of those things. And it makes me incorporate some of those things into my playing and also into my teaching. So I think, the stereotype, the cliche is that, the teacher is learning just as much from the student as the student is from the teacher. And I think that's definitely true.
What is your favorite orchestral excerpt on the bass?
The first one that pops into mind is Probably Mozart. I mean, he's one of my favorite composers. I just love his music. It's infused with a lot of joy, and the physicality of playing it on bass like is very stimulating.
What was the last book you read?
I've been kind of making my way through a book called The Art of Smart Football. As a Chiefs fan, I find myself watching and having only a base understanding of what's going on the field. And I've been kind of getting into podcasts and reading articles by experts and kind of really breaking down what's going on the field. I find that pretty interesting.
Do you have any pets that we might feature on the Pets of Kansas City Symphony?
I do. I have two cats. I think one kind of wandered through in the background. The other one is out on the screened-in patio to avoid. She seems to know when I'm on a Zoom call, and she comes in and yells really loudly for me to feed her.
Well, I've been asking in every one of my interviews about your favorite Kansas City barbecue restaurants. For you, I'm going to elaborate on that usual question. Still going to want you to answer, but also ask you what kind of beer you're drinking with it. You are a bass player after all.
I think my personal favorite is Joe's KC, just because their ribs are just absolutely top notch. So if I had to rank it just on that, I think that I would rank them first. But I do have some other specialties from other places that I think are really great. I think that the brisket from Q39 is really good, and I really like the burnt in sandwich from Gates. In terms of beer, when I was a younger man, I had more strict guidelines about what kind of beer I wanted to be drinking. But as I age, I find that any beer that somebody is handing me is one that's perfectly good enough for me. And I'm not the type to necessarily pair my beer with my food.
Well, you mentioned the last book about being about football. If I remember correctly, you're very involved in the Symphony's Fantasy Football League. What are some of your strategies for picking a fantasy football team?
Well, I'm pretty sure that I was the driving force behind the founding of the Orchestra Fantasy Football League. In terms of my strategy, I've read a little bit about fantasy football, like kind of analytics, because it's not necessarily just about picking the most talented players. It's about getting the best value at each round. So, for example, like if Patrick Mahomes, okay, he's the best quarterback in the NFL, and he's probably going to be a really good fantasy football player as well because of his statistics. But if you had the first overall draft pick, you probably shouldn't take him for a lot of reasons. If I had a strategy, it's about positional scarcity. For running back position, there's usually a couple of really top performers, and then as you as they become more scarce, the performance falls off at a much steeper rate. Whereas, like, even if you have the number, 18 or 20th best quarterback in the league, they're going to still do good performance.
In addition to playing the bass, I know you do a good bit of conducting. What's it like about conducting rather than playing that you enjoy? And what are some groups that you've gotten to lead?
My very first conducting job that I got paid for, I was hired by Jason Sieber to when he was music director of the Louisville Youth Orchestra. And he conducted the advanced orchestra, and he hired me to conduct the intermediate orchestra. So my first big conducting experience was, diving right in and doing a youth orchestra. So I did that for 3 or 4 years. I conducted a chamber orchestra in Louisville that was their mission was for retired senior citizens to play. I currently am the director of the Lenexa Community Orchestra, and I've been doing that for 4 or 5 years. We just finished our fourth season, though this year we had to find some online content due to the pandemic. I've gotten to do a couple rehearsals with the University of Kansas Orchestra. The opportunity to stand in front of an orchestra is one of the greatest privileges that any musician can have. Just like with teaching an instrument, I think standing on the podium and working with groups is a really great learning experience. I think that there's something special about working with students and amateur musicians who are there to learn and to be for the love of playing. So I think that's a really enriching experience.
Back in early to mid-March, when the city and the orchestra shut down for COVID, you and your wife, Angela, were one of the first people I was concerned with because you weren't here in Kansas City. Tell us about where you were at that time and what your experience was coming back to Kansas City.
In February, everybody had already found out, kind of known about COVID-19, coronavirus. We had bought plane tickets to go to Tokyo. So when COVID happened, Japan at the time, they had a couple hundred cases. And so we were a little worried about it, but we thought, like, we looked up the data and we looked up the recommendations, and we decided to go ahead with the trip and just used caution while we were there. It ended up being a really amazing trip. A lot of the things, like the museums that we wanted to go to, ended up being closed, but it was pretty incredible. Most of the public spaces, like the temples, were all open. All the stores and restaurants were open. And whereas we might not have gotten the feeling of like a bustling, crowded metropolis because fewer people were going out in Tokyo and Kyoto where we went, when we got back, so we left on March 2nd and got back on March 12th. And just in that 10-day span, like, everything had changed in the US. Everything had changed. It went from being like coronavirus was something that was happening somewhere else to coronavirus was serious. It was happening everywhere. And we landed, late at night, and our cab driver was talking to us about everything, and he was saying about how, oh yeah, there's like no toilet paper or hand sanitizer at the store. And this was just pretty mind-blowing to us because when we left, there was really nothing going on. But when we were in Japan, we were pretty amused by 95% of everybody there was wearing a mask in public. We just assume like that's kind of part of their culture, that during cold and flu season or during allergy season, people just tend to wear face masks. And little did we know that very soon in our future, that would become part of American culture too.
Well, Richard, this has been really fun talking with you and getting to know you a little bit better. I've learned a lot about you. We're blessed to have a phenomenal bass section here at the Kansas City Symphony, and you've been an outstanding part of the reason for that. Your leadership on stage as well as off when you chaired our musicians committee in recent years is very welcome and very much appreciated. So thanks for making your home here in Kansas City and with the Kansas City Symphony and helping stabilize our bass section for nearly a decade. So we hope that's longer, and thanks for joining me on this.
Thanks, Justin.